Shadows on summer streets. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue across the cracked sidewalks and worn-out storefronts along Lincoln Avenue. The hum of the city never fully stopped in this part of town. Children's laughter mixed with the low thud of bass-heavy music spilling from passing cars and the distant metallic rattle of the elevated train tracks overhead. The air smelled of fried food from corner vendors, exhaust fumes, and the faintest whiff of summer rain waiting in the clouds. 18-year-old Emmanuels walked briskly, her black backpack slung over one shoulder, her other hand clutching her phone as she typed out a quick text to her mom. Staying a bit late at the debate club. Be home soon. Love you. Her acceptance letter from Howard University was still taped proudly to the refrigerator door at home, a symbol of every late-night study session, every extra credit project, every moment of self-doubt she had fought through. Graduation was only weeks away, and every step she took felt like moving toward the life she'd spent years building. But life had a way of shifting the ground under her feet. As she neared the intersection by Carter's Market, a local corner store everyone knew for overpriced snacks and a freezer that barely worked, she heard the sirens before she saw the lights. 3 police cars, lights flashing, engines running hot. Officers moved in chaotic bursts, shouting commands to unseen suspects. The whole block tensed as conversations hushed and heads turned. Imani slowed her pace, her heart tapping a quicker beat against her ribs. She wasn't involved in whatever was happening, but there was an unspoken rule in neighborhoods like this: stay clear when the cops swarm. Her plan was simple: cross the street, take the long way home, avoid it all. She had almost made it past the mouth of the alley when a sharp voice cut through the humid air. "Hey, you, stop." Imani's breath caught in her throat, her steps faltering. She glanced around, but there was no one else nearby. "You in the hoodie, hands where I can see him." The fear was instant and electric, coiling in her stomach and radiating outward. Her black hoodie, the same one she'd worn hundreds of times, now felt like a bullseye painted across her back. She froze, slowly lifting her hands to shoulder height, palms out. I'm just walking home," she said, her voice dry in her throat. "I didn't do anything." 2 officers approached, hands resting on their holstered weapons. One was stocky, red-faced, with a bristly mustache and a badge that read O'Donnell. The other was younger, leaner, with sharp features, and the name tag Carver. Their eyes swept over her with the detached precision of men sorting through livestock at an auction. "We got a suspect match. Black hoodie, jeans, backpack. You fit the bill, sweetheart," O'Donnell said, his tone thick with authority. What suspect? I've been at school all day. You can check." Bag on the ground. "Hands behind your head," Carver interrupted, his voice colder. Imani's mind raced through her mother's lessons. Keep calm, don't argue, don't reach, don't run. She set her backpack down carefully, fingers trembling. Even as her hands moved behind her head, her pulse roared in her ears. A flash of movement. Carver was already unzipping her backpack, fingers digging through her books and laptop pouch. Government textbook, calculus notebook, a crushed granola bar. Nothing remarkable. And then the badge. It was small, discreet, almost forgettable, unless you knew what you were looking at. The CIA emblem glinted faintly under the dim streetlight. Carver's brows shot up. "What the hell is this?" O'Donnell took the badge, turning it over in his hands like it might crumble. "You playing pretend, sweetheart. Printing out fake badges online now. Who gave you this?" "It's real," Imani said, voice shaking but firm. "I'm part of a recruitment program. High school outreach. It's CALD." "Save it," O'Donnell barked. "We'll figure out what you are downtown. Turn around." The cold metal cuffs snapped tight around her wrists before she could even process what was happening. Her protests died in her throat. She wasn't being heard. She wasn't being seen. She was just a suspect. The back of the squad car was stifling. the plastic seat sticky against her skin. Imani twisted her wrists, trying to relieve the pressure of the cuffs, her mind cycling through a growing storm of disbelief and fear. This can't be happening. They'll check the cameras, talk to my teachers. They'll see. But deep down, a colder fear settled in. What if they don't? What if none of that matters? The station was no better. The fluorescent lights were harsh, the walls painted a dull institutional gray. They processed her like she was nothing. Fingerprints, mugshot, confiscated belongings. Her CIA badge was shoved into an evidence bag, as if it were a toy. Not a passport to the future she'd worked so hard to reach. Hours blurred into each other, each minute chipping away at her sense of reality. O'Donnell and Carver passed her holding cell a few times, exchanging looks and quiet mutters she couldn't make out. Sometimes they smirked. Other times they ignored her completely. At one point, a new face appeared. A black woman in her 50s with kind eyes that didn't quite mask her weariness. Her badge read Detective Morgan. She didn't say much at first, just unlocked Imani's cuffs long enough for her to stretch her hands and sip from a bottle of water. "You get one call, sweetheart," Morgan said softly, her voice gentler than the others. Imani's fingers shook as she punched in her mom's number, her breath catching with every ring. "Hello, Mom." Her voice cracked. "Mom, they arrested me. Please, please come." The line filled with her mother's sharp inhale, then an unsteady "I'm coming. I'm coming right now." Imani slumped against the cold metal bench after the call ended, her mind a whirlwind of fractured fears. She had been walking home, thinking about debate practice and graduation and Howard and the stupid dance her friends were trying to convince her to go to. Now she was a suspect in a robbery she didn't even know had happened. Somewhere deep inside her, a small ember flickered. This wasn't how her story ended. She didn't know how, but this was not where her fight stopped. She had worked too hard. She was more than their suspect. Between chains and choices, the walls of the holding cell seemed closer now, like the air had thickened, pressing inward on Emmanuel's. The narrow bench left no room for comfort, and the fluorescent light overhead buzzed with the kind of mechanical indifference that made her feel like nothing more than a shadow, a smudge someone could wipe away with a single stroke. Her wrists throbbed where the cuffs had bitten into her skin. She stared at the faint red marks, trying to rub at them as if erasing the physical pain could somehow ease the gnawing dread rising in her stomach. Her mother's voice still echoed in her ears from the call. There was fear in it, yes, but there was something else too. A sharpness, a fierce edge honed from years of knowing exactly how thin the line was for black mothers and their daughters. It was the voice of a woman who knew that being innocent didn't always matter. The clatter of the cell door jolted her. Detective Morgan returned, her posture a little more relaxed than the first time they met, but her expression unreadable. "Your mom's on her way," Morgan said, her voice low. "She's bringing a lawyer." Imani swallowed hard. "They won't believe me," she whispered. "They already decided I did it." Morgan leaned her back against the opposite wall, crossing her arms. "They don't know you, baby. To them, you're just a hoodie, a girl who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. I was at school. There's proof. My teachers, my classmates, my debate coach." Morgan lifted a hand, quieting her gently. "They'll say people lie for their friends. They'll say the cameras were down, or the footage is lost, or some witness saw you, and that's all they need." Imani's fingers curled into fists in her lap. "But that's not." "I know," Morgan said softly, "but knowing isn't enough. It's never enough." That truth hung heavy between them, a truth Imani had known all her life, but hoped she'd never have to face head-on. Good grades, scholarships, college acceptance letters. None of it was armor when the system already saw her as a threat. The door buzzed open again, and Davina Wells stormed in like a summer thunderstorm, her presence filling every inch of space. Her work blouse was rumpled, braids pulled into a tight ponytail, and her purse strap was twisted in her grip like she was resisting the urge to throw it at someone. "My baby." Davina's voice cracked on the second word. Imani stood, arms wrapping around her mother before the tears could even fully form. Davina squeezed her so tight it was hard to breathe. But Imani didn't care. She needed to feel something real. Behind Davina, a man stepped into the room. Marcus Legrand, the Wells family lawyer for the last decade, was all calm authority in a charcoal gray suit. He was the kind of man whose presence carried weight, not because he raised his voice, but because he never needed to. "Imani," Marcus greeted with a reassuring nod. "We're going to handle this." His calm should have made her feel better, but fear clung stubbornly to her ribs. "Detective," Marcus added, turning to Morgan, "why exactly is my client being held here with no charges filed?" Morgan's jaw tightened slightly. "That's above me right now." Officers O'Donnell and Carver picked her up under suspicion of robbery. "Suspicion based on what?" Marcus pressed. "Eyewitness ID, physical evidence, something more than being a black girl in the wrong place." Morgan hesitated just long enough for Imani to feel it. That hesitation told her everything she needed to know. There was no case, only suspicion spun from thin air. "I'll get her out," Marcus promised, hand firm on Davina's shoulder. "They've already overstepped." But getting out was only the first battle. The first hearing. 2 hours later, Imani stood shackled at her wrists and ankles, wearing the same hoodie and jeans she'd worn to school that morning, clothes that had somehow transformed into a criminal uniform in the eyes of the law. She stood in a side room waiting for her initial appearance before a magistrate. The hearing was mostly a formality. Officers stating their case, the magistrate deciding whether she'd go home or stay locked up until they found more evidence. O'Donnell and Carver stood nearby, the smugness practically oozing off them. O'Donnell didn't bother to hide the smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You've got real potential, kid," he said. "Could have used that imagination for something useful instead of running scams." "What scam?" Imani snapped, unable to hold back. "I go to school. I'm going to Howard on a scholarship. Check my records." O'Donnell leaned in close enough for her to feel his breath. "Nobody cares about records, sweetheart. All it takes is one witness, one bad night, and your whole future's gone. Welcome to real life." Imani's fists trembled at her sides. She'd always known there were two versions of real life, the one where hard work paid off, and the one where your skin color decided everything before you even got a chance. Now she was living in the second one. Evidence that isn't there. Inside the hearing room, Marcus Legrand's voice was calm steel. "My client has a perfect attendance record, corroborated by school records, teachers, and classmates. There is no physical evidence tying her to the robbery, and her only connection is being in proximity to a scene she was unaware of." The assistant DA, a sour-faced woman named Monroe, folded her hands neatly on the table. An eyewitness placed her at the scene. Marcus didn't blink. A paid informant with a history of providing unreliable testimony. This witness, have they been vetted for credibility? Are they being compensated in any way? Monroe's lips tightened. "The investigation is ongoing." "That's legalese for we don't have anything," Marcus said flatly. O'Donnell shifted in his seat, knuckles whitening. Carver kept his eyes down. But the magistrate was cautious. "Until the investigation is complete, I'm denying bail," she said. "She'll remain in custody until the next hearing." Davina's gasp echoed loudest in the room. Imani felt her knees wobble, her hands cold. The chains clinked as she was led away, her mother's tearful voice calling after her. "Hold on, baby. We're gonna get you out." But the walls were closing in again. Inside the system, the county lockup was louder, harsher than the holding cell had been. Women in varying states of exhaustion filled the room, some sitting on metal bunks, others pacing the perimeter like restless lions. Every noise felt sharper, every look a potential threat. Imani sat on the edge of her cot, knees pulled to her chest, trying to disappear inside her own mind. Her heart beat a relentless rhythm against her ribs, matching the drip-drip-drip of a leaking pipe overhead. The CIA badge, the one symbol of her future, was now locked in an evidence room somewhere, probably passed around by officers who laughed at the absurdity of a black teenage girl working with the CIA. It was more believable to them that she was a criminal. But Imani wasn't done. Her mother would fight. Marcus would fight. And she would fight too. Because if they were going to take her future, they were going to have to drag it from her hands. As the steel door clanged shut for the night, Imani closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "I'm more than what they see. Truth, lies, and the weight of shadows." The night in county lockup had been longer than any night Imani Wells had ever known. Even the dim glow from the high, barred window couldn't break the heavy darkness sitting on her chest. Each time her eyelids fluttered shut, her mind rewound the same scene. Her body pressed against the police car, metal cuffs cold on her wrists, Officer O'Donnell's voice slithering into her ear like a threat dipped in venom. By morning, her resolve had hardened. Fear still lived inside her, tucked into every crevice of her ribs, but something else was growing alongside it. Anger. Not the reckless kind, but the kind that sharpened her focus. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This wasn't about a description that happened to match. This was targeted, and the only way out was through. A visitor and a warning. The next morning, the sound of her cell door grinding open snapped her back to the present. Detective Morgan stood there, her expression unreadable. "Your lawyer's here," she said, stepping aside. Marcus Legrand, always the picture of calm professionalism, entered the cell. His suit was as crisp as ever, but there was a tightness around his eyes that made Imani's stomach twist. They sat on the metal bench, facing away from the other women in the holding area. "Imani," Marcus started, his voice low. "We've got a problem." Imani's throat dried. "What now?" "There's no security footage from the store," Marcus said. "The cameras were conveniently down that day. No video to prove you weren't there." Her stomach dropped. "But my school records, my teachers, they can prove I wasn't even near that place." "They can. And we're gathering affidavits from everyone who saw you that day. Your debate coach, the bus driver, even some classmates. But here's the thing." Marcus glanced toward the door, then back at her. "The DA is pushing hard to make this stick." "Why?" Imani's voice was a whisper. "They know I didn't do it. Because O'Donnell and Carver are playing dirty. They're telling the DA you resisted, that you lied about your ID, and they're painting you as a clever kid who knew how to game the system." Imani's fists curled in her lap. "That's a lie." "It doesn't matter if it's a lie," Marcus said softly. "What matters is whether they can sell it." The weight of those words settled heavy in her chest. She was a story now, one they were writing without her input. The black girl with the suspicious badge, too smart for her own good, trying to run a con. "What about the CIA?" she asked. "Can't they just confirm I'm part of the program?" "That's another complication." Marcus exhaled sharply. "Your program is low level, part of their high potential outreach, sure, but it's technically classified. The agency doesn't like shining a spotlight on recruits, especially not over local arrests. We've sent requests, but no response yet. So they might just leave me here." Imani's voice was quiet. "Maybe," Marcus said honestly, "but if they do, we'll fight without them." The courtroom battlefield. 2 days later, Imani stood at the defense table in a cramped DC courtroom, chains still wrapped around her ankles. The courtroom was small, almost claustrophobic, with wood-paneled walls dulled by decades of cigarette smoke and city grit. A handful of reporters, tipped off by someone in the system, filled the back row. Davina Wells sat in the front, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were pale. Every breath she took was visible, like she was trying to breathe for both of them. The assistant DA, Deborah Monroe, stood at the prosecutor's table, a woman with tightly pinned hair and a voice honed for dispassion. She delivered her opening statement with cold efficiency. Emmanuel's, matching the description, caught near the scene, in possession of a suspicious, possibly fake government ID. Circumstantial, Marcus muttered under his breath. Imani swallowed, fingers trembling under the table. O'Donnell took the stand first. His uniform was pressed to perfection, his demeanor dripping with manufactured authority. He painted a scene that barely resembled reality. She was evasive, O'Donnell said, his voice smooth, wouldn't make eye contact, kept shifting around like she was looking for an escape route. Imani's stomach twisted. She had this badge in her bag, O'Donnell continued. Claimed it was CIA. Real low-effort forgery, just enough to throw us off. When I asked her direct questions, she gave half answers, couldn't explain why she was so close to the crime scene. Marcus stood slowly when it was his turn to cross-examine. His steps were unhurried, deliberate, each one meant to remind the jury that he was in no rush because the truth was on his side. Officer O'Donnell, Marcus began, can you tell me, did you actually see my client commit this robbery? No, O'Donnell admitted. Did you see her exit the store? No. So your entire case hinges on proximity and a hoodie. There was more than that, O'Donnell said quickly. We had an eyewitness who saw her. Marcus tilted his head. This eyewitness, Travis Brown, was he someone you've worked with before? O'Donnell's jaw flexed. I can't disclose informant relationships. Marcus smiled faintly. I'll take that as a yes. The witness who never saw her. Travis Brown was exactly what Imani expected. A man whose loyalty came with a price tag. His shirt was wrinkled, his collar stained with sweat, and his story was just a little too rehearsed. I saw her, Travis said, tapping the witness stand with 2 fingers, running out the back of the store. Marcus approached slowly, hands clasped behind his back. Mr. Brown, you've been a police informant for how long? Off and on. Couple years. And you've been compensated for your help. Travis squirmed. Sometimes. Did you receive anything in exchange for identifying my client? Travis's gaze darted to Monroe, then to O'Donnell, then back to Marcus. Nah. I saw her. Even though you previously stated, under oath, you were on a smoke break at the auto shop down the street, a shop that was closed that day. Travis's mouth opened, closed. Sweat beaded at his temple. Mr. Brown, is it possible someone encouraged you to identify Emmanuel's? Travis said nothing. Did someone suggest you pick her face out of a lineup? Still silence. Mr. Brown, Marcus leaned in slightly. Did Officers O'Donnell or Carver offer you anything? Cash, favors, protection, to say you saw her? Objection. Monroe barked. Speculation. Marcus smiled again. Withdrawn. He turned to the judge. I have no further questions. I think Mr. Brown's silence speaks for itself. The badge that told the truth. The turning point came when Marcus produced Imani's CIA recruitment letter. It wasn't the full classified file. They couldn't get that. But it was enough. Signed by a mid-level field liaison, it confirmed Imani's participation in the high-potential outreach program. This is real, Marcus said, holding it up for the jury. The badge is real. Her credentials are real. The only fake thing here is the case against her. The courtroom was silent. The aftermath of the first battle. The judge didn't dismiss the case. Not yet. But he did order Imani released on her own recognizance while the investigation continued. It was a small victory, but to Imani, it felt like sunlight cracking through a storm. As she stepped outside the courthouse, the first cameras flashed. Reporters shouted, asking about her badge, her internship, her arrest. Davina held her daughter's hand tight, whispering, "We're not done." Imani knew that. This wasn't a one-day fight. This was the opening battle of a much bigger war, not just for her freedom, but for every kid like her, every future stolen by bad cops and broken systems. She didn't know if the CIA would back her or if they'd erase her existence to protect themselves. But either way, she was ready to fight. Whispers behind the badge. The sun was already sinking low over southeast D.C. when Emmanuelle stepped through her own front door for the first time in 4 days. The air inside the small apartment was thick, with the scent of leftover spaghetti, faint lavender air freshener, and something less tangible: worry, fear, and unspoken prayers that still clung to the walls. Her mother, Davina, hadn't let go of her hand since they'd left the courthouse. Now, standing inside their modest living room, Davina pulled her daughter close, both arms wrapping tight around Imani's shoulders. "Baby, you're home," Davina whispered into her hair. "You're home." Imani's arms encircled her mother's waist, fingers curling into the familiar fabric of her mom's worn sweater. Her throat was too tight to speak, so she just stood there, letting herself feel it. The warmth of home, the safety of the one person who always believed her. But home wasn't where this ended. Not even close. Unfinished business. They sat at the kitchen table that evening, the table that had held homework assignments, birthday cakes, and late-night bills when money got tight. Now, it was covered in manila folders, legal pads, and Marcus Legrand's laptop, all set up like a war room. "Imani," Marcus began, his hands folded. "You're out for now, but the charges haven't been dropped. We made them blink. That's all. They're still building their case." Imani glanced at her mom, whose face was taut with exhaustion, her braids starting to fray at the edges from stress. "They don't have a case," Imani said, voice flat. "I didn't do anything." Marcus nodded. "That's true, but the truth isn't always enough. O'Donnell and Carver aren't ordinary cops. They're part of an old game." Imani frowned. "What do you mean?" Marcus leaned back in his chair. "In some precincts. Not all, but enough. Officers build their careers on clearing cases. It doesn't matter if they clear them the right way. They manufacture suspects, lean on unreliable informants, and feed prosecutors cases that are neat and tidy, whether they're true or not." Imani's chest tightened. "You're saying they knew I was innocent the whole time?" "They didn't care," Marcus said. "To them, you were a name that fit their puzzle. A young black girl walking near the scene. Hoodie, backpack, clothes enough. And when they found the CIA badge, that made you perfect. A little mystery they could twist however they needed." Imani's hands curled into fists in her lap. She had always known the system was rigged. Everyone in her neighborhood knew. But hearing it laid out like this, hearing how easily her entire life had been slotted into someone's ambition, made her stomach churn. "We can't just fight this case," Marcus said. "We have to expose them." Detective Morgan's warning. The next morning, Imani sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone, catching up on texts from classmates. Most were supportive. "We got your back, girl." Some were cautious, and a few, the kind that made her gut twist, were thinly veiled accusations. "Guess we didn't know you as well as we thought." Her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She hesitated before answering. "Hello. It's Detective Morgan." Imani sat straighter. "Oh, hi. I need to meet with you," Morgan said, her voice low and hurried. "Somewhere private." Imani's pulse quickened. "Why?" "Because O'Donnell and Carver aren't just bad apples. They're part of a bigger pattern. And if you're serious about exposing them, you're gonna need more than a good lawyer." A meeting in the shadows. 2 hours later, Imani sat in the back corner of a quiet, nearly empty diner off Martin Luther King Jr. Avenue. Detective Morgan slid into the booth across from her, dressed in civilian clothes, jeans, a simple jacket, and sunglasses she didn't remove. Imani could feel the tension radiating off her. "You okay?" Imani asked. Morgan gave a short nod. "I've been on this force for 23 years, she said. "I've seen good cops, bad cops, and everything in between. But O'Donnell and Carver, they're part of a crew. Not official, not a gang with colors or hand signs, but they have a code, and it's about control. Imani swallowed hard. Control. They don't just solve crimes, they create them, Morgan said. When crime rates spike, the mayor's office leans on the department. The department leans on the precinct captains, and guys like O'Donnell and Carver. They make problems disappear. Disappear how? By feeding the system the people who are easiest to frame. Kids who've been in trouble before. Immigrants without papers. And smart, black girls who can't disappear quietly. Imani's stomach turned. So I was a trophy. Morgan's lips pressed into a thin line. You were a tool. They figured no one would believe you. The girl with the CIA badge. They thought it was too far-fetched, too ridiculous. That made you easy to break. Imani's fingers curled around her water glass, knuckles white. What do I do? Morgan leaned forward. You fight. But not just in court. You fight outside the system, too. You make noise. You gather proof. You find every person they've hurt, every kid they've locked up to boost their stats. Imani's voice was low but fierce. And then, Morgan's smile was grim. And then you burn their house of lies to the ground. The names. Over the next week, Imani, her mom, Marcus, and a small circle of trusted friends turned their living room into a command center. Sticky notes covered the walls. Dates, names, cases. Some of the names Morgan had provided were already familiar to Imani. Kids from her neighborhood who had caught cases out of nowhere. A boy named Deshawn who got locked up for a stolen bike he never touched. A girl named Tanya who spent months in juvenile detention for a robbery that never happened. Imani made calls, her voice shaking at first, but gaining strength with every conversation. Hi, my name's Imani Wells. I was arrested by Officers O'Donnell and Carver. I think they framed me. Did they do the same to you? One by one, the stories poured in. Some were too afraid to speak out. Too many years of knowing silence was safer. But others were ready, angry, hungry for justice. By the end of the week, Imani had 9 names, 9 stories, 9 lives broken by the same 2 officers. And then there was Travis Brown. The informant's regret. Travis Brown didn't answer her first 3 calls. But the 4th time, his voice came through the line, hoarse and wary. Why are you calling me? Because you lied about me, Imani said, her voice steady. But I think you're tired of lying for them. A long silence stretched between them. You don't know what they can do, Travis whispered. I know exactly what they can do, Imani replied, because they already did it to me. Another silence, and then, meet me at Street Albans Park, tomorrow, after dark. The ticking clock. Imani didn't know how much time she had before O'Donnell and Carver came after her again. She wasn't just some random suspect anymore. She was a threat, and threats had a way of disappearing. But she also knew something else. They were afraid of her now, not because she was powerful, but because she was free, because she knew their secrets, and because she wasn't afraid to scream them to the world. As she sat on her bed that night, her CIA outreach manual resting in her lap, she traced the edges of the agency emblem embossed on the cover. They taught her how to think like an analyst, how to piece together patterns, how to follow trails that others missed. Now she was following a trail of her own, straight to the heart of the corruption that tried to bury her. Secrets in the dark. Street Albans Park didn't look like much after sundown. The chain swings creaked softly in the breeze, and the skeletal frame of the rusting jungle gym cast warped shadows onto the cracked pavement below. Streetlights hummed overhead, their flickering glow cutting thin slices of light across the uneven grass. Imani stood near the old picnic table at the center of the park, her fingers curled around the strap of her backpack like it was a lifeline. She shouldn't have come alone. Marcus had insisted on escorting her, but Imani knew that would scare Travis Brown away. Men like Travis didn't talk if they thought a lawyer was waiting to pounce. Her mother had begged her to stay home. But Imani's whole life felt like it had been confiscated, and the only way to get it back was to face the truth, even if that truth came from the trembling mouth of the man who had lied to put her behind bars. The wind shifted, and Imani heard footsteps crunching against gravel. She turned, her heart clenching, until she saw the hunched shape moving toward her. Travis Brown was thinner than she remembered, the kind of thin that hunger and fear carved into a man's bones. His jacket hung off his shoulders, and a cigarette dangled from his lips, unlit. "You came alone." His voice was low, hoarse, like it hadn't been used much lately. Imani nodded, though her pulse pounded in her ears. Travis glanced around, rubbing his palms together as if trying to warm hands that had never fully thawed. "You shouldn't trust me." "I don't," Imani said simply. "But I think you want to do one thing right, at least once." Travis flinched, his eyes darting toward the darkened playground, the shadows under the trees, anywhere but at her face. "Why'd you pick me?" Imani asked softly. "Why did they tell you to say it was me?" He dragged a hand down his face, the calluses on his fingers scraping against the stubble on his chin. "You were convenient, kid." His voice was nearly a whisper. "They don't need reasons. They just need faces." "What do you mean?" Travis exhaled sharply. "O'Donnell and Carver. They got a system. Every month, they need to clear a quota. Arrests, solved cases, paperwork that makes the precinct look clean. You think they care about the truth? They just need bodies to hang crimes on. Black bodies, brown bodies, kids with no rich uncles or TV lawyers." Imani's throat tightened, "And they pay you to lie." Travis looked away, shame flickering across his face. "They don't even pay much. Sometimes it's cash. Sometimes it's just keeping me off the list. I lie for them. They look the other way when I get caught hustling. But it's getting worse. They're picking people who don't even fit. They just need warm bodies. You were just next." Imani's fingers tightened around her bag. "You knew I didn't do it. You knew I was still at school." He looked at her then, and Imani saw the guilt swimming in his eyes. "They told me you were smart, real smart, had that badge. They said you'd be too smart to fight, that you'd just cut a deal and walk away. Walk away with a record, you mean?" Travis nodded, his face crumpling. "I'm sorry, kid. I really am. But you know how it is, in this city, a black girl's word against two cops. You never had a chance." Imani's hands were trembling, but not from fear anymore. Rage was coiling inside her, not the wild kind that exploded, but the slow-burning type that sharpened her focus to a razor point. "You're wrong about one thing," she said quietly. "What's that?" Travis asked. "I have a chance, and I'm gonna take it." The files they buried. The next morning, Imani met Marcus at his office, the dimly lit corner suite of a modest brick building, sandwiched between a barber shop and a check cashing place. His desk was already stacked high with folders, sticky notes, and a legal pad covered in his small, precise handwriting. "What'd he say?" Marcus asked, skipping the pleasantries. Imani repeated everything. The quotas, the paid lies, the chilling way O'Donnell and Carver treated people like chess pieces. Marcus listened, fingers steepled, eyes narrowed. "It fits. I've been tracking similar cases for a while, but getting anyone to speak on record is nearly impossible. People are scared. Some already took plea deals just to get home, even if they were innocent. Then we find more," Imani said, her voice steadier than she expected. "There's got to be a trail. Paperwork, reports, something." Marcus gave her a long, appraising look. "You want to help. Fine. But you need to understand something, Imani. These guys don't play fair. They won't just smear your name. If they think you're a threat, they'll go after you, your mom, anyone close." Imani's stomach twisted, but she squared her shoulders. "They already tried to bury me once. I'm still here." Marcus tapped his pen against the desk, then flipped open a file. "There's something I need you to see." He turned the folder around. Inside were incident reports, dozens of them. Different names, different dates, but the signatures were almost always the same. O'Donnell. Carver. The same descriptions appeared over and over. Suspect resisted. Suspicious behavior. Suspect attempted to flee. Imani's chest tightened. The same language they used for her. "These are the ones we found so far," Marcus said. "There are probably dozens more, but the kicker? Half of these arrests were built on eyewitness testimony. Guess whose name keeps showing up?" "Travis," Imani said quietly. Marcus nodded. They built a career on this. Awards, promotions, all of it on the backs of kids they framed. "You're not the first, Imani. You were just supposed to be easy." Imani's fingers trembled, but she forced herself to breathe. "Then we make them regret picking me." The CIA call. That afternoon, Imani's phone rang. An unfamiliar DC number. She stepped onto her apartment balcony, fingers trembling slightly as she answered. "Imani Wells." "Yes. This is Olivia Harrington. From Langley. We've been monitoring your situation." Imani's breath caught in her throat. "And?" There was a pause, the kind where too much is being said without words. "We're limited in how much we can intervene. But your internship, your file, it's been quietly verified to the courts. That's why they had to let you out. So you're backing me. We're confirming your legitimacy. That's all. What you do with it is your call. But remember, we prefer our interns to avoid publicity." "I didn't pick this fight," Imani said sharply. "They brought it to me." Another pause. "Then finish it. Just be careful. Not everyone you expose is going to sit quietly. Some people, especially officers with a lot to lose, will come after you. You understand?" Imani swallowed hard. "I understand." "Good luck, Imani." The line went dead. She stared at the phone in her hand. The CIA wouldn't protect her. Not really. They'd only protect their image. But that was fine. She wasn't doing this for them. She was doing it for every kid whose name got twisted into a lie because they were too easy to frame. And for herself. Voices they tried to silence. The morning after Imani's quiet, cryptic call with Olivia Harrington, the sky over DC was a steel gray, low-hanging clouds rolling in like a warning. Imani sat at the kitchen table, coffee growing cold between her hands, while her mother flipped through a bulging folder of affidavits, timelines, and statements gathered over the last week. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Davina asked softly, her eyes lined with the kind of exhaustion that lived in the bones of mothers who had been fighting invisible wars their whole lives. "It's not just you they'll come after." Imani's fingers curled around her mug, the ceramic warm against her skin. "I know." She had thought about that. Thought about the ripple effect every step forward would cause. O'Donnell and Carver weren't just random bad apples. They were part of a rotten tree, roots digging deep into the city's machinery. And people like her, people who shined light into dark corners, often paid the price. But silence wasn't an option anymore. Not for her. "They already came for me," Imani said quietly. "They already tried to erase me. If I let them scare me into backing down, I might as well have stayed in that cell." Her mother's eyes softened, tears glimmering at the edges. "You're stronger than I was at your age." Imani shook her head. "No, Mom. I'm only strong because I watched you." A knock at the door interrupted them. Marcus Legrand stepped inside, briefcase in one hand, a worn notepad in the other. His tie was slightly loosened, his eyes carrying the kind of alertness that said he hadn't slept much. Behind him, standing uncertainly in the hallway, was Travis Brown. The sight of him sent an electric jolt through Imani's chest. The man who'd falsely identified her, the man who almost shattered her future, now stood in her doorway. Eyes downcast, shoulders hunched, as if expecting a slap that hadn't come yet. "Come in," Imani said, her voice tight but steady. Travis shuffled inside, his worn sneakers dragging over the linoleum floor. Davina gave him a hard, measuring glance but said nothing. This was Imani's fight to steer. Travis has agreed to testify, Marcus said, closing the door behind him. He's scared, but he's ready. Imani folded her arms, leaning against the edge of the table. Why now? Travis didn't look up. Because I can't sleep, he muttered. Not since they put you in cuffs. I knew you didn't belong there. But I still pointed at you. Imani could feel her mother's eyes flick between them, but she held her ground. You're right, she said. You lied. And now you get to fix it. Travis finally met her gaze, his own bloodshot and heavy. I will. Building the case. Over the next 3 days, Marcus worked around the clock with Imani and Davina to assemble a case bigger than Imani's arrest alone. They weren't just proving her innocence. They were proving a pattern, a system. Imani combed through incident reports, piecing together a timeline of O'Donnell and Carver's clearance rates. Every month where crime stats needed to drop, their arrest numbers spiked. Every time pressure came down from City Hall, new suspects miraculously appeared. Marcus traced over a dozen arrests tied to paid informants like Travis, all of whom were now willing, some hesitantly, some angrily, to come forward. It's not just about me anymore, Imani said late one night, eyes gritty with exhaustion as she flipped through a printout listing those arrested under the officer's watch. It's about all of us. Every single person they threw away. You're making this bigger than a personal case, Marcus said, setting his coffee down beside her. You're making this systemic. Imani gave a thin smile. It was always systemic. The threats begin. The first call came at 2:14 a.m. The phone on Imani's nightstand buzzed, waking her from restless sleep. She stared at the blocked number, her heartbeat quickening before she even answered. You don't know what you're playing with. The voice was distorted, but the threat was clear. Imani's grip tightened around the phone. Who is this? Click. The next day, her mother found a manila envelope tucked under their windshield wiper. Inside was a single photograph, a surveillance-style shot of Imani walking home from school, a red X drawn across her face. Davina's hand shook as she held it up to Marcus. They're watching her. They're scared of her, Marcus corrected. That's why they're doing this. That didn't make it less terrifying. Going public. On the 4th day, with Marcus's reluctant blessing, Imani stood in front of a cluster of microphones outside the courthouse. The press conference was small, only a handful of local outlets, a couple of independent journalists. But it was enough. The cameras flashed as Imani stepped up to the microphone, her hands clutching her prepared statement so tightly the edges of the paper curled. My name is Imani Wells, she began, voice clear despite the tremble in her stomach. I'm 18 years old. I'm a student, a daughter, and a soon-to-be freshman at Howard University. She paused, inhaling slowly. 2 weeks ago, I was arrested for a crime I didn't commit. I was accused, detained, and treated like a criminal, not because of evidence, but because of what I looked like and where I was standing. The cameras clicked. Journalists scribbled notes. But this isn't just about me, she continued. Officers O'Donnell and Carver have a pattern, a long history of framing innocent people, feeding the system names to meet quotas and win promotions. I'm not their first victim. And if we don't do something, I won't be their last. She held up a sheet of paper covered in names. These are just some of the people they arrested under false pretenses. People who lost jobs, homes, scholarships. Some of them are still in jail. I'm here today to demand accountability. Not just for me, but for all of us. She set the paper down, hands shaking slightly, and finished with a final firm declaration. I won't be silent. I won't disappear. And if you think you can intimidate me into walking away, you're wrong. A brief hush followed before the questions erupted, shouted from all directions. Imani, do you fear retaliation? Are you accusing the entire department? Are you still affiliated with the CIA? Imani stood firm, answering only one question before stepping away. I fear nothing more than silence. The backlash. That night, the threats escalated. A rock through the window. A spray-painted warning on the sidewalk outside their building. Now ITCHES GETSTITCES. Tavina wanted to leave. Pack up. Go stay with family out of town until the trial. But Imani wouldn't budge. If we leave, they win. Marcus installed security cameras at their door. Neighbors kept a closer watch. Even Detective Morgan, off the record, promised to keep her ear to the ground. But the fear, that constant hum of danger, was becoming part of Imani's life. She ate dinner with the curtains closed. She memorized license plates of unfamiliar cars. Every walk outside felt like stepping into crosshairs. Still, she didn't stop. Breaking news. 2 days later, a local investigative journalist broke the story wide open. Using the files Imani and Marcus provided, they published a scathing expose on O'Donnell and Carver's history of misconduct, framing, and pay-for-testimony schemes. The article didn't just mention Imani's case, it laid out the whole pattern. The headline read, "Pattern of Corruption in D.C. Precinct. Innocent teens framed to boost clearance rates." It named Imani as the whistleblower, but it also named every person who had come forward. Their stories, their charges, their ruined futures, all in print for the world to see. By morning, the mayor's office had called for a full internal review. O'Donnell and Carver were suspended pending investigation. It wasn't justice yet, but the first crack had formed. And Imani wasn't done. The verdict and the voice that wouldn't break. The air inside the courtroom felt heavier than concrete. The ceiling fan spun lazily overhead, doing little to cut through the stifling tension hanging in the room. Imani Wells sat at the defense table, her back straight, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles glowed white beneath her skin. The cuffs were gone this time, but she could still feel the ghost of them, the cold bite of metal around her wrists, as if her body refused to forget. Today wasn't just about her. It was about all of them. The faces of every name on that list. The boys and girls, the mothers and sons, the people O'Donnell and Carver had swept into their machine of lies, sat behind her in the gallery. Some were free now, thanks to Marcus's tireless efforts. Others were still trying to claw their way out of the wreckage. And a few were simply ghosts, lives so thoroughly broken by the system that they had disappeared into silence. But Imani wasn't silent. She was here, and she was ready. The case they didn't expect. The courtroom wasn't just full, it was packed. Not just with families and reporters, but with activists, legal observers, even representatives from the Department of Justice, quietly watching from the back row. The press had run with Imani's story, dubbing her the teen who took on the badge. Some saw her as a hero, others painted her as a troublemaker, an agitator, a liar with an agenda. She didn't care. O'Donnell and Carver sat at the prosecution table, their lawyer leaning over occasionally to whisper in their ears. O'Donnell still wore that smugness, the kind of confidence that came from knowing the system had always protected him. Carver's hands were restless on the table, his knee bouncing beneath his too tight slacks. They expected this to be her word against theirs. They didn't expect a case built from the bones of every victim they'd ever buried. Testimonies that shattered silence. Marcus Legrand stood, his calm presence filling the room like a lighthouse beam cutting through storm clouds. "Your Honor," Marcus began, "we aren't here today just to clear Imani Wells' name. We are here to expose a pattern of misconduct, abuse, and outright fabrication by Officers O'Donnell and Carver. A pattern that has ruined countless lives and shattered community trust." He called his first witness, Travis Brown. The man who nearly destroyed Imani's future shuffled to the stand, his shoulders curled inward, sweat gathering along his brow. His voice was low at first, hoarse, hesitant, but the weight of guilt had worn him thin, and it all came spilling out. "They paid me," he said. "Sometimes cash, sometimes just favors. You know, letting me skate on minor stuff. All they needed was a face they could pin things on. It wasn't about solving crimes. It was about making sure it looked like they were solving crimes." He glanced at Imani, his voice cracking. "I lied about her. I knew she didn't do it." O'Donnell's lawyer objected. "This is speculation, unproven." But Marcus simply held up a folder full of statements from other informants who had told the exact same story. Pattern established. Then came the mothers. A line of women, one after the other, stood before the court and testified to the nightmare of watching their children vanish into the system, framed for crimes they never committed. They spoke of late-night knocks on the door, terrified phone calls, court dates where they were told to take plea deals or face decades in prison, all based on fabricated evidence and phony eyewitness accounts. One mother, voice trembling but resolute, held up a photo of her son. "This is Deshaun," she said. "He spent a year in juvie because of these officers. He's home now, but he's not the same. He's afraid to leave the house, afraid of his own shadow. They didn't just steal his time, they stole his sense of safety." The weight of their stories crushed the courtroom into silence. The officer's defense crumbles. O'Donnell took the stand with the same bravado he always carried. He leaned back in the chair, arms crossed, answering Marcus's questions with the clipped, condescending tone of a man who didn't think he needed to explain himself. "I followed procedures," he repeated. "Every arrest was by the book." Marcus, patient as ever, began pulling receipts. Surveillance footage showing O'Donnell meeting Travis Brown behind a liquor store before one of his identifications. Records showing spikes in arrests every month leading up to performance reviews. Emails between O'Donnell and Carver joking about finding a couple fresh faces whenever crime stats needed a boost. The jury's eyes widened. Even the judge's stern mask cracked slightly. The system protected them, until the system itself was forced to look. Imani speaks. And then it was Imani's turn. She stood at the witness stand, her hands trembling only slightly. Marcus had asked her if she wanted to testify, told her it wasn't required. But she needed to. Not for the jury. For herself. She looked O'Donnell and Carver in the eyes as she spoke. "I was walking home from school," she said softly. "I was thinking about my debate meeting, about graduation, about Howard University. And then, two men decided I fit a story they were writing." Her voice grew stronger. "They didn't care about my GPA, or my scholarship, or the fact that I was part of a government internship program. They saw my skin, my hoodie, my backpack, and that was all they needed to decide who I was." She paused, letting the truth settle over the room. "But I'm not just that girl in the hoodie. I'm a daughter, a friend, a student, and I'm standing here because they underestimated me." She turned toward the jury. "I am not the only one. Every name you've heard today, every kid, every mother, every life they tried to erase. We are all here, and we're not going away." The verdict. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. O'Donnell and Carver were found guilty on multiple counts: conspiracy, perjury, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations. They were led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the same way they had led so many others. But this time, the system didn't shield them. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Cameras flashed. Microphones crowded toward Imani, but she held up a hand, her voice calm but firm. "This isn't the end," she said. "It's just the beginning. A new path." Weeks later, as summer crept into fall, Imani stood outside her dorm at Howard University. The campus buzzed with life. Students laughing, hurrying to class, debating politics in front of the student union. She had made it. Despite everything, she was here. Her phone buzzed. A message from Olivia Harrington at the CIA. "Proud of you. Let's talk soon." Imani smiled faintly, slipping the phone into her pocket. The CIA hadn't saved her, But maybe, just maybe, she could use her voice and her knowledge to make sure this never happened to anyone else. At night, when the dorm was quiet, she opened her laptop and began writing letters to lawmakers, opinion pieces for local papers, proposals for police oversight reforms. Because silence had almost swallowed her whole. And now her voice was the loudest thing in the room. The end, but not the finish line. Emmanuel's didn't just survive. She built a megaphone out of the very system that tried to silence her, and handed it to everyone they'd ever try to erase. Because justice isn't something you wait for, it's something you fight for. And Emmanuel's, she was ready for the next fight.